Everybody, and welcome to another video of the People Analytics channel. And we're going to continue our series today of the top 10 metrics you can use to start your People Analytics team from scratch. And we're really rounding out the top 10. We're at number 9. Today we're going to discuss one of my favorite metrics, which is the data-driven 9-box. Now I'm sure as HR professionals you're familiar with the 9-box process. Typically you use this as part of your talent review discussions where you have executives in a room, you evaluate all your top talent, and you calibrate based on their own personal interactions where somebody should be placed on the box. That's all well and good, very important stuff, but the data-driven 9-box actually provides you a counterbalance because it's looking at objective criteria and it's calibrating your top talent based on how they perform given data points that your executives care about. So I'm going to walk you through actually how to calculate a data-driven 9-box, then the process for creating an agreement index comparing the traditional SME input 9-box versus your data-driven 9-box, and then I'll walk you through some of the best practices for how to use the data that you identify in this 9-box for development planning, and then you can automate your leadership development plan based on the gaps that you identify. So please hit like and subscribe, and let's start learning. Okay, we're rounding out the top 10 metrics you can use to start your People Analytics team from scratch. And today we're going to go over a really fun one, number 9, which is the data-driven 9-box. And essentially what this 9-box does is it really helps challenge a lot of the executive opinions around their top talent. And the idea is we're not trying to say that a particular high potential is not great, doesn't have a high ceiling, but what the data-driven 9-box does is it uses all of the data points in the company to highlight development gaps. And once you highlight those development gaps, you can use that to actually create a fully automated leadership development plan that helps connect assignments with mentoring, assessments, and training. So the data-driven 9-box is really a great thing in your tool belt to help improve the quality of your talent reviews and also the post-talent review meeting development actions. As with all of my videos, I love to start with Albert Einstein, and his quote about simplicity is very applicable for the HR domain. He said, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." And when it comes to the talent review process, the normal 9-box where you take SME input and based on a calibration meeting, you kind of determine where an employee is put in the 9-box, that's all well and good, but it has a lot of biases. The data-driven component allows you to assign objective criteria. That objective criteria then can be fed into a model that determines where employees are placed using data, and then you have a better conversation. You're comparing the data-driven 9-box with the SME 9-box and calculating an agreement index. While it seems very complicated, if you keep Einstein's quote in mind, making sure that everything is simple and that the whole purpose is to have a better conversation, then the tool will be very effective. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the traditional 9-box. On the horizontal axis, you have performance, and on the vertical axis, you have potential. And essentially, you use SME input and calibration meetings to determine where an employee should be placed, looking at factors such as how they performed during their performance reviews on projects and so forth, as well as what is their potential, looking at leadership assessments, 360 feedback, and so forth. The 9-box is actually a very effective tool, and if it's used effectively within the calibration meetings, it can help you calibrate your top high potentials against each other. The one problem is that it's highly subjective, and it's traditionally based against heuristic biases. So if an executive believes in someone, obviously they're going to put that person in some of the top right boxes, even if that individual has clear development gaps. As you look at the data-driven 9-box, what you're going to find is that individuals still are listed, but their data gaps are easily identified because it's based on objective criteria. So the traditional method, very powerful, very useful for calibration meetings, and you still want to continue it, but you have to understand it's subject to heuristic biases, and if an executive likes someone, they're traditionally going to overlook a lot of their gaps, and if they don't like someone, they're probably going to overlook a lot of their strengths as well. Now, by comparison, the data-driven 9-box is actually a very fun tool because it only looks at objective criteria. So you see the same 9-box grid, horizontal axis performance, vertical axis potential, but what determines where someone is placed is the objective data points that you can pull directly from the system that are not subject to SME input. So this could include things such as promotion velocity, performance reviews, 360 feedback, leadership assessments, how well they've performed in their critical assignments, and so forth. So essentially what you're trying to achieve here is you're trying to identify what objective criteria can be pulled directly from the system, and then how do you use that objective criteria to calibrate high potential talent against each other. And some of the KPIs we've gone over for the top 10 metrics could actually be incorporated into this, whether it's learning days per employee, employee productivity, and so forth. But the idea is that for the data-driven 9 box, you establish criteria for each box, and then you basically pull directly from the system, and the data points for the employees determine where they land on the box. And even if the executives think a particular individual is fantastic, if their data suggests that they're a box 5, then that's where they'll go. And basically, once you have the data-driven 9 box, you compare it to the SME 9 box, and you see the difference. Okay, so let's go over the 6-step process for actually calculating a data-driven 9 box. And again, remember Einstein's quote, keep it simple. Even though this is a lot of data-heavy stuff, once you understand that it's a very simple 6-step process, you'll be able to execute this and embed it into your talent reviews. The first step is you assign weights for each box. You want to categorize what are the best boxes versus what are the worst boxes. So on the top right is the best score, it's worth 100 points, and on the bottom left, which is the worst box, that's worth 10, and that helps you calibrate the value of each box. The second step is you establish criteria. So within each box, there should be specific criteria, and it should get harder as you go to the top right and easier as you go to the bottom left. Then you want to automate your data collection and make sure that all of the data points are pulled directly from the system and do not include SME feedback. And then the fourth step is you calculate an agreement index, looking at the SME input 9 box versus your data-driven 9 box, and understand where the differences are. Once you've done that, the fifth step is to determine the development gaps. Once you see where someone is good and where someone has weaknesses, you can automate the leadership development plan directly from the data-driven 9 box. And then the last step is you link it to succession planning using the succession planning strength score, which I covered in a different video. The first step in the process is you want to assign scoring weights to the 9-box grid. So in the top right-hand box, which is the best box, it's worth 100 points. And the bottom left, which is the worst box, it's worth 10. And in between, you can see how the different point values change. You might ask yourself, why are we assigning points to each individual box? And it's because it allows us to calculate a KPI once we look at our entire talent pool. And the formula is very simple. You essentially take the actual points earned by an employee. So if they're located in box 5, they would get 50 points. If they're located in box 1, they would get 100 points, and so forth. The idea is wherever the data-driven 9 box places them, you give them actual points based on the value of points assigned to that box, and then you divide it by the maximum points available. So the maximum points available is always going to be 100, or box 1. The idea is that if you had 10 employees and they were all in box 1, then those 10 employees would get 100 points, and the maximum available would be 100. So the score would be 100. But let's say everybody lands in box 5, well, they're only getting 50 points, where the maximum available was 100, so the score would be 50 or 50%. So you can kind of see how you can use the data-driven 9 box to create an average score for your talent, and that'll tell you where basically everyone is landing on the grid. Step 2, you actually establish objective criteria for each box on your grid. Now, when you see all these data points, don't freak out. Remember, let's keep it simple. But essentially what you're trying to do is identify what are those objective data points that allows you to automatically calibrate and differentiate your top talent without requesting subjective heuristic bias input from your SMEs. So as an example, for box 1, you can see we're looking at promotion velocity, their projected age when they're placed as an executive, 360 feedback, leadership assessments, their D&I profile, so on and so forth. But the idea with this is you want to ensure that the criteria can be directly pulled from the system, that it's applicable for all employees, and that once you establish this criteria, and this is very important, it should actually become easier as you descend down the 9 box. So if I'm looking at box 1, The promotion velocity, for example, should be the most aggressive promotion velocity in the company. And when you go to box 5 and box 9, it should actually become easier. And what that does is it allows only the best employees based on their data to be assigned to box 1. And then when you get to box 5, box 9, and so forth, easier data points, it allows more employees to fall within those boxes, and it helps you with your calibration. Very important as you progress to step 3, which is automating your data collection. Remember, you're already calculating your SME input 9 box, which is very subjective. Their opinions are important, but if you're going to have a data-driven 9 box, you need to make sure that the objective criteria you've established for each of your 9 box grids can be directly sourced from the system. And the only way a data-driven 9 box becomes a valid tool is that if it doesn't include any of the heuristic biases that impact some of the more subjective elements of your traditional 9 box. Now, to make sure that this works, you actually want to utilize all data types. That includes structured data, so basically your employee HRIS file, anything that can be placed within SQL Server, but also unstructured data. For this to be a really advanced tool, you want to pull in all the potential data points that you can, which includes emails, sentiment analysis, PDFs, video files, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. The data-driven 9 box can be very basic and start very small, but as you become more sophisticated in data science, you can pull in practically any data point impacting employees and use that as part of the objective criteria that calibrates and differentiates your top talent. So this step 3, it may seem simple, but it's critical. The automation of data collection is important so that people actually trust the data-driven 9 box is objective and fair. Step 4, and here's where the fun begins. So essentially we have 2 9 boxes. The first is your traditional executive 9 box, which is completed as part of a talent review discussion. All the executives sit in a room and they discuss the employees and calibrate them based on their personal interactions and determine where they go in the 9 box grid. That's very traditional. Then we have the data-driven 9 box, where we've established objective criteria for each of the boxes in the grid. We pull directly from the IT sources the data points that impact that criteria, and then that's how employees are assigned. Once we have those 2 9 boxes, the next step is to determine what are the differences. And this really helps you understand, is there too many heuristic biases impacting the executive viewpoint, or have we not calculated the objective criteria correctly? And more importantly, it also helps inform what development gaps are in place and what needs to be done so that the executive view and the data-driven view come closer into agreement. So to give you an example, if the executives have 5 employees placed in box 1 and the data-driven 9 box only has 3 employees based in box 1, we need to understand what are the key differences of those 2 employees, and based on those differences, that'll help inform our development actions, and also it'll give a check and balance to the executives to make sure that their opinions are actually correct and accurate. Step 5 is to determine the development gaps, and this is where the data-driven 9 box becomes very powerful, because once you identify the development gaps of an individual, you can actually automate their leadership development roadmap and their development actions for the future upcoming cycle without having to create narratives, do meeting minutes, or anything like that. So for example, if someone is placed in box 1, in the traditional SME 9 box, there would be kind of a discussion about, well, are there gaps for their people conversations? Do they have 360 feedback, derailers, so on and so forth? And then those discussions would kind of feed into a suggested development plan. It's a very inefficient process, especially when you're trying to scale this for thousands of employees. Using the data-driven 9 box, once you've established criteria to determine whether or not an individual should be in box 1 or box 5, and also how they rank within that box compared to other employees, then you're going to know what are the factors that they're very good at and what are the factors that you're trying to improve. So using this example, even if someone's in box 1, if they have a derailer for people conversations, or if they're low in data science skills, or if they're missing certain assignments that are important for their long-term development, the roadmap will tell you that, the data-driven 9 box criteria will tell you that, and then you can automate the development actions and feed them into the planning cycle for future development. And the last step in this process is you want to link the data-driven 9-box to your succession plans. And if you've watched my other videos, you can kind of see how the data-driven 9-box directly feeds into the succession planning strength score. Because essentially what you're doing with the 9-box process is you're trying to determine the potential performance and readiness of employees. So if you've utilized your SME kind of biased-based, subjective-based 9-box, you've compared it to your data-driven 9-box and calculated an agreement index, based on that, you're going to have a very strong view of what an employee's potential performance and readiness is. And once you do that, you can actually embed this into the succession planning strength score, which will help determine whether or not certain tables have high quality successors and certain tables have gaps. So the important thing with this is, remember, all of these metrics I'm going over with you are fully connected. They're tied to the people analytics value chain and they're tied to each other. So once you do the data-driven 9-box, you're going to be able to automate the development actions, but at the same point, you're going to be able to directly feed this into your succession planning strength score and your tables. And that's what makes it very powerful. Using an example, we have our high potential employee and we're trying to determine how we can use objective data to place this employee within the 9-box. Now for this example, I'm only going to use one data point, which is promotion velocity, but for you to understand, it's really important. A great data-driven 9-box uses pretty much every data point you can think of and calibrates using criteria that makes box 1 very difficult for an employee to land in and box 9 relatively easy. And through that calibration, it helps differentiate your talent. So in this example, you can see in box 1, promotion velocity criteria says that a person should be promoted every 2 years or faster. In box 5, they should be promoted every 3 to 4 years. And in box 9, they should be promoted 4 years or greater. That's just one data point. Now you can see on the left-hand side there's multiple data points that we could potentially use, but for this example we're only looking at promotion velocity. Since this employee, based on their data, is only promoted every 3.5 years, you can see that they'd be placed in box 5. So this is a great example. An executive might really like this individual and say this person is a box 1 talent, but based on the criteria we've established and using promotion velocity, this individual is actually box 5. And that's what makes these talent review meetings so powerful, because it highlights the differences between executive viewpoints and the data. And that's it. What a fun conversation. So please join me next time where we discuss the last of the top 10 indicators, attrition at risk. Now, if you like this content, please hit like and subscribe. I try to upload new videos every week. And remember, keep on learning. This is fun stuff.